Boardroom Bound, episode 123, How to Speak Up and Stand Your Ground in the Boardroom, with Steve Albrecht.
But you got to stand up. You have to stand up for what you believe. You've always got to do that. It's the right thing to do. And if you do that, the long-term rewards are great. The short-term costs might seem significant, but at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we'll be speaking with Steve Albrecht. Now, Steve has served on about 10 corporate boards, 4 public companies, 6 large private companies, and he's turned down far more opportunities than those 10. He has served as a board chair, lead independent director. He's been a member of the nomination governing committee, compensation committees, and he has chaired the audit committee of every board he has served on. And under his time, several of the boards that he has worked on have sold at record premiums. And Steve has a great story about he was the right guy with the right expertise that boards needed when the world changed in 2002. Sarbanes-Oxley came into pass, and financial experts were essential and required. And Steve has been the guy in speed dial ever since. That has given him great background experience he will share with us today and some fantastic insights for all of us. Let's jump into the show. Steve Albrecht, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Happy to be here.
Well, delighted to have you today. It was from a mutual connection of ours, Michael Montalongo, and I always love when our guests recommend other people who'd be good guests, and he was sharing about with me your specific skill set and background expertise and how at a certain time when the laws changed, you became exactly the person that every board needed and wanted to have serving alongside them. So it'll be really interesting for our audience to hear. But before we get to that transitional point, can you just give us your background and we'll just look at it as a position of expertise, and then it'll become very clear why that became so influential in the boardroom space.
Sure. I graduated from Brigham Young University in accounting. I went to work for Deloitte, back then in Touche Ross at the time. And after a year, decided to go to graduate school, went to the University of Wisconsin, got an MBA and a PhD. I taught first at University of Illinois, and then Stanford, and then came back to Brigham Young University. I'm from Utah. Along the way, I was a productive scholar and teacher and enjoyed academia very much, but I always kept one foot in the business world. And so I've sort of had 4 occupations in the business world while I've been a professor. The first one involved a lot of in-house training and teaching for corporations. The second one was actually doing actual consulting for companies. The third was becoming an expert witness, and a lot of the research I'd done related to fraud. I'd written some books, and people started calling me to do fraud consulting, and then expert witnessing. And so I testified in some of the really big fraud cases. I was an expert in the Enron case, Tyco, Adelphia, Lincoln Savings and Loan. In total, I've testified in 38 major fraud cases as an expert witness. And then in 2003, I was a dean of the business school at BYU, and we were hosting executives, as many business schools do, and I had lunch with an executive, and he asked me to recommend some people for audit committees. Every company was looking for audit committee chairs and audit committee financial experts, as the new Sarbanes-Oxley Act required. And so I recommended 3 people I knew really well on the East Coast. This was a company called Red Hat. We just sold it not long ago to IBM. And one of them was an ex-Big Four partner, one was an ex-CFO of a large company, and one was an academic on the East Coast. And then he called me back and said, how about you? And so that was my first board, but within probably 2 or 3 months, every firm was looking for a financial expert at that time because it was required under the new SOX Act. And so I got probably 8 or 10 invitations to serve on boards all at once. I accepted the first 3 public companies and the first 3 private companies that called me. They were all good companies. And so over time now, along the way, at one point in 2009, that was in 2003, in 2009, I resigned from all my boards, went to Japan to do service for 3 years for my church and with my wife, and then came back, and fortunately all the boards I was on asked me to come back and serve again, and I didn't accept them all, but I accepted some, and then since then I've joined a couple more. So in total I've served on 11 corporate boards.
So there's so many things to ask about there. One, it sounds exhausting trying to align alone the logistics of that many boards at one time, multiple public company boards roll that are planning out for multiple years. You have to make sure everything aligns, and certainly then fitting maybe some of the private companies, and it might be a little bit more flexible. I don't think most people alone even imagine how complex that must be, right?
Well, you're right. If I would have known how much work each of those boards were, I probably wouldn't have joined quite so many. But what I did is I prepared an annual schedule. I chaired the audit committee of every company whose board I've served on, and also because I teach MBAs or taught MBAs at BYU about corporate governance and boards of directors, I've been on every company's governance, nomination governance committee. And I've also served on some compensation committees. So, yeah, what I did is I prepared an annual schedule for the committee I was in charge of, which was the audit committee. Worked with the controller and the CFO so that they sent me a draft agenda from the annual agenda that I'd prepared. They'd send that about a month in advance of our meetings. I would then, that would sort of be the draft agenda, and then we would update it for anything that needed to be added or current. It was current, and we would have the CFO, the CEO, the other audit committee members look at it and see if they wanted to add anything, and if not, that became our agenda. So we started with a default agenda, and because I had them send it to me rather than me send it to them, I always got in plenty of time, and it allowed me to stay organized. I've always found that boards take a lot of time, and you need to be the most prepared person in the boardroom. And in fact, you ought to be over-prepared. And so that habit has stood me well over the years as we've merged with companies, and in every case, I've been a surviving board member.
Now, there are many places we can go here. Let's talk about audit committees for a second. And I think there are some people that probably think that when I get on a board, I'm going to run the other way. I'm not a finance person. I don't want to know that. And some organizations can be far more complex than others. But I'd love your thoughts on this. I would actually argue, I would think that would be the perfect place for just about every new board member to start being on that committee. That would be the best place to learn the business and how it operates. I would love your perspective.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's the audit committee that looks at the financials of the company, or you have oversight for risk, you have oversight for anything financial, all the controls, cybersecurity, everything that anything that relates to any of those areas you have oversight for, and you learn the company much better if you understand the financial language and the financials of the company. I would encourage every new board member to start on the audit committee. I think you learn a tremendous amount about the company. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the audit committee that carries the heavy load on a board. Now, today governance with trying to decide who should be on boards and committees is real, and how you deal with ESG and diversity and all those things is important, and compensation is really important because there's lots of interest in how much executives are paid, and equity and bonuses and all those kind of things. So all the committees do a lot of work, but at the end of the day, it's the audit committee that does the heavy lifting and where you get to know the company the best.
And clearly, you talked about that point in time in 2003 when the world changed from a board perspective. Sarbanes-Oxley, there was much more focus on the board, much more perhaps litigious aspects, risk involved for people who were board members. And you were just sort of making that comment about these were the first ones that called me. There are probably so many that would have called you. There is, of course, still the requirement to have someone at least, I'm sure every organization wants at least multiple financially qualified SEC experts on those boards, and not only from a succession planning, right? Because you want to think about the future chair behind it. I would love to hear your perspective on how someone should put their candidacy out there. So, for example, people ask me, how do I get on a board? One of the things that I know as a finance guy, well, just be an SEC qualified finance expert. They're always looking for those positions on boards. As someone who has chaired audit committees, you're obviously thinking, you're probably talking to the Nom/Gov committee going, these are the types of people that I want to need. If someone was coming up to you, Steve, saying, how do I best position myself and get my candidacy out there? What's the advice that you give?
Well, the easiest way to get on a board is to be a CEO of a company. Everybody likes to have CEOs or ex-CEOs on their boards. I'm not sure they're the best board members, but they're the ones that everybody's looking for. The second easiest way is to have some kind of special knowledge. And that knowledge, if you have financial knowledge, that's always really good because every public company board is required to have at least one financial expert, and most have more than one. You could have deep industry knowledge, especially in things like technology and social networking and things like that would be really helpful, or cyber risk. But you need to have some special knowledge that you contribute, can bring to the board to elevate the discussion in the room. And then after that, I think it's all about networking. If you're qualified and you network and you join organizations like the National Association of Corporate Directors and their chapters, and you talk to attorneys and you that work with boards of directors, and you talk to auditors that work with boards of directors. And I mean, at the end of the day, the hardest board to get on is the first one. But after you're on one and you get a reputation, I can't tell you how many times I've been invited on other boards by people I serve with on a different board, and I've turned far more board opportunities down than I've taken. So it's about being prepared, being skilled, and having the right experience, and then it's about networking.
I think you're one of the few, if not only, guest on my show who's ever said, I've turned down more than I possibly care to be on. And I'm sure that will probably continue for you, Steve. So that's a good problem to have, and I'm sure most of my listeners would be thrilled to have that. But like you said, the hardest part is getting that first one, and you do well, it's likely to lead to others. But I'd appreciate your thoughts on that, because I know you've already talked about how it's demanding, you need to be very prepared. I know that there are, based on your background and experience from you being an expert witness, talking about the things that happened at Enron and Tyco, places like that, integrity is incredibly important for you, not only probably as an individual, but for the whole board that you're working with, and certainly having that being part of the organization. I would love your thoughts on how an individual board member represents that, how a whole board represents that, and how they try to make that part of the company ethos.
Sure. Let me answer that with an example. So, in 2003, I joined the board of Red Hat Corporation, and it was a young company. We had about $200 million in revenue. The stock was selling at $3.75 a share or something like that. And they brought me in to be the audit committee chair, and also to serve on the compensation committee. So, in my first audit committee chair, they had a Big Four auditor. As I prepared for that meeting, I decided, and I wasn't the only one, but I decided that our revenue recognition method was probably not the best. It was an approximation method. It worked while the company was little or small and young. But we were now getting bigger, and we were about break even in terms of income. And so what we were using is the half-month revenue method, which means that if we sold a subscription in the first half of the month, we recognized the full month. If we sold it in the last half of the month, we recognized half a month. So I looked at that as an accounting professor and one who studied accounting a lot, and I said, well, you can't sell something on the 30th day of the month and recognize a half a month, or you can't sell it on the 15th and recognize the full month. So it just didn't seem right to me, and so I said, I really think we need to go to a more exact method. We need to use daily recognition. And all of a sudden, everybody on the board said, Steve, we can't do that. We're about break even. If we change our accounting for revenue, then we're going to have to restate the financial statements. If we restate the financial statements, we're going to be sued. And so at the end of the day, we had lots of discussions. The Big Four firm, they said, our Big Four firm endorses our method, therefore it's got to be okay. And then we just happened to get a new partner who was starting to ask questions about it as well. Anyway, so one night we were on the phone. We were on the phone all the time with attorneys. I was on the phone with Wilmer Hale out of Boston. I live in Utah. And I finally was getting frustrated because people were all arguing against me. And I said, at the end of the day, I said, whose responsibility is it to make this decision? And they said, well, as the audit committee chair, it's yours. And I said, then we're going to take the high road. We're going to change. It doesn't matter what happens. If we get sued, we get sued, but we're going to take the high road. Well, we did change, and immediately we had 17 class action lawsuits against us and 3 derivatives cases where stockholders sue on behalf of the company and sue the board members. Anyway, all of a sudden I was the GOAT. Everybody was wondering why they put me on the audit committee, and why they put me on the board, and I think they had regrets, actually. Well, about a month later, the SEC came and said, we'd been watching your revenue recognition method. We were going to make you change, but because you did it proactively and changed, we're not going to file a Wells notice or anything like that, and we congratulate you on making the right choice.
I hope you have that framed on your wall.
Anyway, I went from GOAT to hero, and at the end of the day, there were lots of companies using that half-month convention, but at the end of the day, everybody appreciated me. In 2009, I resigned from the board, went to Japan to do service. 2011, they called and said, when are you coming back? I said, next year. They said, well, we want to put you back on the board. If we're looking for 2 more board members, if you're willing to come back, then we're only looking for 1. I went back on the board when I came back. As you well know, the story probably of Red Hat. We took the company to great heights. We ended up selling it for $195 a share to Red Hat. So I said to them at the time, why do you want me back on the board? And they said, because your compass always points true north, and we've missed that in the boardroom. I could give you lots of examples like that, but at the end of the day, I made a fair amount of money because I went back on that board, especially when we sold it. So integrity always pays. And it doesn't matter in the short run if there's costs, if there's litigation or whatever, it pays to take the high road. And I could give you a lot more examples, but that's just one.
Now, that is a fabulous example, and I'm sure if I were going to summarize it up, you'd probably say, you have to be able to speak up and stand your ground if you think you're right. And as the chair of the audit committee, right, you got to make that decision in the end. So kudos to you for actually doing that. I imagine it almost feels a little different, perhaps, when you're going around the room during discussion and executive committee session, maybe where everyone has one vote, and even if you're convinced you're right, maybe you're, depending on how persuasive you are, to convince others to your side, but you have to probably follow those same principles of standing up for what you believe in. How does it translate over into that sort of situation?
So I'll use the same company example. Years later, we were considering bringing on a new board member, and this particular board member in the personal life had some issues. And we went around the room, very well qualified potential board member. We went around the room and everybody, the first few people around the room said, I think we need to bring him on, or it would be great. Add diversity, all kinds of stuff. And then it came to me and I said, I can't vote to bring this person on. And they said, how come? And I said, well, there's these personal issues that I just don't want to have in the company. I can't be more specific than that right now, but... And then the attorney for the company, the chief legal counsel, said, well, Steve saved us once. I'd like to hear why he feels so strongly that way. And I did. I spoke up again, and we ended up not bringing that person on the board. So, I can't tell you how many times you got to speak up. I mean, I was on another board where there was a 34-year chair of the board who was our largest shareholder, aside from some big institutional investors. He founded the company, and we ended up terminating from the board and terminating him as CEO. And, those aren't fun examples, but at the end of the day, and then, I became chairman of that board and he sued and brought two people on, and, but you got to stand up. You have to stand up for what you believe. You've always got to do that. It's the right thing to do. And if you do that, the long-term rewards are great. The short-term costs might seem significant, but at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do.
Well, Steve, I believe in that, and I like that. And I would love to hear your thoughts on, if you're clearly doing the right things around the board space and the corporate governance sector, you want that to filter down to beyond just that discussion for that group of people, right? So clearly you're interacting with management. Ideally, you'd like the whole organization to be working to that integrity standard. Any thoughts or experiences that you've had where you're thinking like, we're going to set the tone here and make sure that it filters down to the rest of the people?
Yeah, in the very best companies I've seen that have done that the best, or were the best at it, were companies where the chief legal counsel took responsibility for compliance and for integrity. And, the board worked very closely, especially the audit committee, with chief legal counsel. And we put proactive signs out across the company all the time, like, and you go into the restroom, there'd be a sign there that says your ethics are showing. And, and we in training and annual sales meetings and things like that, we did training about integrity. And, if you have to lose a sale, it's okay. But what's not okay is to compromise or have a side deal or something like that. And, we didn't have any more litigation in the company because integrity was so important for the board, the entire board, and it was so important for the executives, and the executives took the lead and made it important for everybody that worked in the company.
I like that. Your ethics are showing. All right. So, Steve, you have served on, I think it's 10 corporate boards, right? 4 public, 6 large private companies, lots of opportunities that you've turned away. And many people in our audience would be going, great, I would love to be in that sort of position, be able to tell the stories that Steve is someday. And part of that stems from that dramatic change in the world. 2003, Sarbox came in, and we know the future will be different than the present. The present's already different than the past. Things will continue to change. From your position, the conversations that you have, your background, your experience, we're clearly seeing a lot of things changing over the last year because of what's happened with COVID, et cetera. But when you sort of look forward, what are the other areas of potential opportunity you see for where change is going to be coming to the boardroom?
Well, first of all, Sarbanes-Oxley was in 2002. It took boards about a year to staff up, so I didn't want you to think it was 2003. As I look forward, I see boards being quite different than they were in the past. In the past, almost our entire focus was on company profits and being as profitable as possible and having as big a return as you can for the shareholders, sort of the Milton Friedman approach. But today, there's a much broader stakeholder interest on behalf of the board. A lot about ESG, a lot about diversity, hiring the right people, representing the community, and all those kind of things. So, there's a lot more opportunities today for women. There's a lot more opportunities for minorities to serve on boards. I think what's going to happen in the future, you're going to have less past CEOs and CEOs on boards, although that's still a really good avenue. And you're going to have more people that bring specific skills. So, for example, social media skills, or technology skills, or anything that, as the economy develops and changes, I think you'll start to see, for example, HR people on boards. I think you'll start to see more legal people on boards. You've got to bring a specific skill going forward. And, in many ways, if I look at what happened to boards in the past, initially they were sort of a group brought together by the CEO. Well, that over time didn't work so well because they basically supported the CEO, and the CEO was wrong, then the outcome was bad. Right. And then you brought a diverse board that was independent. And that independent board was really important. I served on one board, for example, where the CEO wanted to put some of his friends on the board, and we said absolutely not. I happened to be on the Nom-Gov committee. I said, no way. We're going to put totally independent people, but we're going to put totally independent people that speak up, who can add value, who can bring in a specific skill that we're interested in. You've got to figure out for yourselves what the future skills set need to be, but I think you'll always need financial, you'll always need industry knowledge, but I do think you'll need more legal, I do think you'll need more technology, I do think you'll need more social networking, I do think you'll need more probably HR kinds of issues, who to hire, how to reward, and all those kind of things. So I see a change. I mean, to be honest with you, I got 3 strikes against me now, and I'm still getting invitations for boards. I mean, I'm male, pale, and stale, right. And at the end of the day, I'm still getting invitations. So if you have the right kind of reputation and you're adding value, let me just give a little personal note, and that is, I've had so many people say, Steve, you're always the first one on the phone, you're the first one to respond to emails, you're the first one that comes back with questions and assignments, and you're the best read for every board meeting. You know exactly what's going on. You learn the company faster than anybody we've seen. You've got to be super responsive if you want to be a good board member. And that means you got to answer calls quickly, emails quickly, text quickly, and you got to respond quickly. And it's got to be accurate, and it's got to be high quality. You got to be able to elevate the discussion in the room.
I think that is fabulous closing advice. That is the example of a great board member, and the kind of board member that people talk about to their friends and go, this is the kind of person you need to have on your board. So clearly in this situation, there's the hurdle of getting that first opportunity, but when you get that opportunity knocked out of the park, and what you've talked about, Steve, is not only doing those things, but do them all well, do them with excellence, and do them with integrity. That has served you well, and I think that's good advice for all of us to follow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a super board member. I just do my best, and that's what we all have to do.
Well, Steve, we were delighted to have you on this show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
You're welcome. Happy to do it, and I'm glad I could help.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Steve Albrecht. This was great to hear from someone who is super experienced in the boardroom, but unlike anybody else we've ever talked to in this show before, has turned down way more board opportunities than anybody I've ever met. That speaks to the fact that he is an excellent board member, right? He talked about in the show how being hyper-responsive, but adding value, being a person of integrity, standing up, doing what's right, all while being the certain subject matter expert that everybody wants and needs to have in the boardroom space. That sounds like a great platform for which to be someone who is sought out for board roles. Clearly something we're all aiming for, that we all want to do and we can all learn from. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to everything we talked about today. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.